Okay, 93. Well, welcome to episode 93 of Retropower Uncut. I'm feeling remarkably better than I have been the last couple of days. I've actually been off work for, I think, the first time in a very long time, with what I suspect was food poisoning. It was not very pleasant at all, but I'm feeling a lot better today. So this is going to be another relatively short week because we're filming on a Wednesday again. But I'm going to start with Morris. We've been doing a few different things, actually a few different things with a few different people. So Scott's been working on the panels in what would be the rear seat area. We're having rear seats. If you remember back to when we did the metal work, the areas in the back here house the battery on one side and the remote servo on the other. And then the rear speakers are also in that area. Now we made a cover panel for one side of this whilst it was in metalwork, so we could kind of prove the concept, check that the speakers fitted, check the components fitted and do the mountings. But actually at the time we duplicated the mounts to this side and didn't make the second cover panel. So Scott's been making up the second cover panel and just fettling them both, making sure they're 100%, doing the holes for the seat belts to pass through, so the seat belt reels actually sit under those cover panels and pass out through a little slot with a bezel around it. He's also put in a little square hole where a charging connector socket goes, so we can plug in a C-Tech charger to charge the battery. So they're looking pretty good. I think the next step is just going to be making sure we've left enough allowance around them for when they're upholstered, and then they'll be ready for upholstery. Speaking of upholstery, James is working on the door cards at the minute, and the 3D scanner's been out yet again, so as a convenient way to pattern up for the door cards, we've 3D scanned the inside of the door, which has obviously the whole information on it and the overall size information, so we can get a really accurate drawing for the door cards on it, and then we can CNC cut those out. So he's just working on that literally now. I think he's going to CNC out a aluminium panel for a start. I think the current plan actually, because we're going to do them as 2 layers laminated. I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but one thing we've often battled with a bit when making door cards is where you have the clips coming through holes in the card. The back side of the clip is obviously on the visible face of the card. And although you obviously go over that with foam and whatever upholstery material goes over the top of that, you tend to be able to still see little bumps from where those clips go through. And both ourselves and Dean at Trimworks, who does our upholstery, have always battled with that problem. I think the current solution Dean's been working with is doing a thin layer of foam over the top with holes around the clips, and then another layer of foam over that without the holes. But then that runs the risk of being able to see inward dimples where they are, especially if you end up pushing hard against the card. So we came up with an idea to try for the first time on this one, which is actually to do the door card itself as 2 laminated layers. So that's what we're going to do, is basically 2 thinner than normal layers, 1.5mm thick, to make the 3mm thick card, and the holes will only be through 1 layer. We'll put the pins in, the clips in from the inside, get the positions of all of those set, trial fit it, make sure we're happy with everything, and then glue another layer over the top of a solid material, either plastic or metal, so that it's completely solid, a completely plain panel on the inside, so there's no hint of them whatsoever. So we'll see if that works out, but hopefully it will. If anybody else has got some top tips on making door cards and solving that problem, basically using a fastener that's not a screw going through from the inside, a push-in fastener, but without any sign of it showing on the inside, I'd be interested to hear what different people do to solve that problem. Next thing on this, we're getting ready to put the bonnet on. Main reason for that is we're doing the mock-up expansion tank. This is just a sort of mock-up of the radiator. We're going to do a foam sculpted top on it, so that then the aluminium fabricator can copy that in the final rad. So we've just been fitting up the bonnet hinges. Stu made those when we were at the metalwork phase. They're like a scissor mechanism and use E30 bonnet gas struts to kind of power assist the bonnet forward, and they have quite a cool sort of forwards and down motion to them. So that's ready for the bonnet to go on now, so we can do that. So I'll hopefully get that on in the next couple of days and start to make some progress there. That's where we're at on the Morris, and if you follow me over here, we shall see a new addition to the workshop. No doubt recognisable to most of you. It's an Opel Manta. We're actually only doing a really small job on this. not something we'd normally take on, but this is a really good friend of ours and one of our earliest customers. I think we first met him probably in 2010, certainly 2011 at the latest. Now this is just almost standard Opel Manta, but a few little changes just to make it drive a bit nicer. It's got the 15-inch version of the normally 14-inch ATS alloy wheel on it, which are a little bit harder to come by, but they just look a little bit smarter and allow room for Willwood brakes, which it's got on the front. It's got Bilstein dampers on it, some decent rated and lowered springs on it, which just bring the driving experience up to scratch a little bit. And then we're doing what is really the final piece of the puzzle in making these, turning these from something which is appealing visually and okay to drive to something that's actually really amazing to drive. They're a very underrated car. In standard form, I think these drive a lot better than an old Escort, a Mark 1 or Mark 2 Escort. Now obviously most people's experience of a Mark II Escort is usually one that's been quite well modified from standard, at which point they do become a lot better, and if you do a full Group 4 prepared one, obviously it takes it to another level again. But as a standard road car, these are exceptionally good to drive. But the biggest downfall you can see over there is the 4-speed transmission, which it's got a horrible feel to the shift for a start. It's an external shift mechanism on it. Far too many joints, and it sort of hangs right out the back. It's a horrible feeling shift, and the 4-speed just isn't really right. The ratios are all over the shop, and it's not long-legged enough to cruise comfortably. So we're putting in the 5-speed. Now they did do the 5-speed in these later on, so it's not a particularly difficult conversion to do. It's mainly standard parts. We'll be doing a custom gearbox crossmember, which John is just fabricating at the minute. On the genuine 5-speed ones of these, they did a different mounting point on the shell, but rather than getting into welding the shell on this one, we're basically making a custom crossmember that offsets the mount further back. And the shifter hole is obviously further back, so whereas the genuine 5-speed ones had a modified top part of the transmission tunnel, like a panel with a raised section, we're basically cutting the whole back, and we're going to make our own raised section that will rivet on there. And then most of the rest of it is standard parts, so it's a standard 5-speed prop shaft. Centre console, because they did a 5-speed, you can get the centre console with the gear stick hole in the right place. The customer's already supplied most of these parts, so the clutch was with it, clutch cable. I think the speedo cable's different, that's been supplied. So it's, apart from doing the transmission tunnel mod and the gearbox crossmember mod, a lot of it is essentially fairly straightforward mechanical bolting stuff together. So yeah, we'll hopefully progress very quickly with this and get that done and back with him in the next couple of weeks. Obviously now I've said that, I'll have cursed it and it will go terribly wrong. Mustang. Finally, it has a front bumper, which has been a long time coming. Mainly because we were waiting for so long for the side mounts, which were on order from Summit Racing. They finally arrived a couple of weeks ago, I think I mentioned it at the time. They were then sent away after we trial fitted it all to get them powder coated. We got a massive batch of stuff back from powder coat this week, and that included all the bumper mounts for this. So finally we've managed to complete the face of this. I'm desperate to show it with you with the bonnet down, because we've got all the lettering and all the trim on the bonnet, but at the moment I think if I put the bonnet down we'd punch holes through it, because the dampers are still sitting up like this, because the mounts for those have been in a tray over there awaiting anodising for ages. But with stuff like anodising, we want to build it all up to a decent sized batch before sending it away, because it's very uneconomical to send stuff away for plating or anodising. It's just 1 or 2 parts, and actually unbelievably economical to do it as big batches. So we tend to have big batches set aside for each different colour and process, and build them up until they're a decent amount. So we're just waiting for a silver anodising batch to build up to a big enough amount to send those away, and then they'll go on. But it's nice to see the bumper on. And speaking of the powder coating, over the other side of the workshop there, out the corner of my eye, I can see the Camaro stuff that we've got back. So we had the front subframe and all of the other related parts, wishbones, I think the axle casing, all the rear axle links, they've all been away to be powder coated. So Rich is on with rebuilding all that stuff up now, because of the fact that the shell is very close to being ready for paint. I'll let Nat show you that later. And we want to get everything mechanical ready to get that rolling, because there's so many big panels on it. with all the engine bay, tinware, wings, front panel, you know, everything's a bolt-on part on those because the body tool effectively stops at the front, at the bulkhead. We haven't really got the space or racking to store those parts once they're painted, so we really need to get the ducks in a row so we can get it kind of rolling straight away, so we can actually put those parts on. Last but not least here, Land Cruiser. Adam was just finishing off the engine last week. I think he's pretty much at the same point on that. The thing that sticks out in my mind that I've seen change is the exhaust manifolds we have blasted and cerakoted. They're the original cast manifolds we're using. They'll do everything we need to do. It's not a high performance build. It doesn't need to be optimized for power, and they're really compact. Nice single outlet that's in the right place on this to point to a hole in the chassis. And they've got the mounts for the lambda sensors we need, so no point doing anything fancy on that other than a decent coating on them. Adam's just fitting the door seals at the minute, which literally just before we started filming I was looking at something on this, and you'll probably have seen us moaning about aftermarket parts before, and just another prime example of a total lack of thought or expectation that you will give a shit, basically. These seals are basically standard extrusion, and there are moulded corners, which is how they would have been originally. So this is a moulding here, and then it will be glued here to a standard extrusion, and that's how the originals would have been made. All good, all the way around, until we realise that the two ends where they join at the bottom are different profiles. And we realise that at the front here, there's a transition from one continuous profile type to another, which makes sense because this side sort of hinges at the inner edge, if you like, and at the front there, it hinges at the outer edge, and I think that's because of the fact that it's in that door jamb area. It's to stop it getting pulled back on itself when you close the door. Except the original one has a transition back again with a moulded corner on the front lower part of the door down there. But these seals don't have that. So I presume they just expect that you'll sort of make do and just butt up the two ends with a different profile. And at the moment, I'm not sure what we're going to be able to do other than that. So we'll be tackling that in a bit more detail in a minute. But yeah, we're at the point on this where we're looking forward to getting all the mechanical bits together. And actually, behind you over there, I think he's stopped swearing now, but Nat is building up the transfer box. How's it going over there?
Well, Cal, I think the word is marvellously. It was going extremely well, and then I've almost simultaneously hit 3 stumbling blocks, some of which were linked together. Obviously, as you can see, Toyota Land Cruiser transfer box rebuild. I have managed to find a manual online. The only really important bit of information in the manual for one of these is the preloads required for the bearings and any clearances required, which, being Toyota and being over-engineered 80 series, we had all assumed would be absolutely fine. And everything thus far has been absolutely fine until I came to put the shims that control the bearing preloads. Sort of as a loose background to this, for those not familiar with one of these, which is probably most people, I'm guessing, there are 3 shafts within one of these. Another bit of background is, for some reason, none of the transmission people we normally deal with wanted to touch this. I don't know why. The automatic gearbox people we use for the auto box didn't want to touch the transfer box, and the manual transmission people that we tend to use also didn't want to touch it. For some reason, nobody seems to want to touch a transfer box, which is strange because it's a lot simpler than a normal gearbox or an automatic transmission. But anyway, regardless of that, within here there are 3 shafts basically. There's a bit more to it than that, but there are basically 3 shafts. Drive comes in that one, turns that one, drives out in that one. Obviously gears get changed in between and things, and diff gets locked and whatever, but basically drive in, idler, drive out. Controlling the preload on the taper roller bearings must have preload when they're installed. Obviously they're installed back to back, so you've got a taper in both directions facing each other, and they have to be clamped with some pressure so that when they're loaded, and perhaps the shaft is driven in one direction or the other by an end load created by helical gears, that doesn't unload one of the bearings. If the bearing unloads completely on one end of the shaft, it will vibrate and that destroys the rollers completely, or spins the bearing in its housing. In either case, it'll destroy itself very quickly, so they have to have preload. Interestingly, when I got to the stage of putting this back together, I've discovered that the biggest bearings in the gearbox, which are the output shaft, which is also the centre differential, don't have any preload. Now the box did have sealer around the split line on it, so it has been apart. And there are normally, as they come from Toyota, apparently, according to the internet, generally 2 shims in here, and there is only 1. I suspect that somebody dropped one of them and didn't put it back in when they had the gearbox apart. I suspect it also hasn't been used much since, because the bearings are all, as far as I can determine, in extremely good condition. There's no marks on any of the bearings, it all looks great. So anyway, by the by, but the preload isn't correct, and there comes a comedy of errors in that the manual I found online for one of these transfer boxes tells me about the preload for the idler shaft, this little dinky little bearing in here, and this shim that sits in there. But it doesn't tell me this one. The page is missing from the manual for this shim, which stumped me quite a bit. After some trawling around online, I managed to find somebody that's photocopied that page from the manual because there was an error on it. Now, I've managed to work through that. It doesn't really matter about the error. All I needed to know was what the preload is that I need to end up with. I can do the rest of the maths fairly easily. Basically, I just need to know how much that shim needs to stick out of this housing in order to clamp that bearing correctly when this housing, which bolts on top of there, is bolted on. Which I've done now, and I now know I need a 0.45mm shim to add to that shim to go in there to make that bearing have the right preload. I haven't actually done that one yet. I'm about to do it. That's one of the bits I use. It's a ground parallel, which you'd use in a milling machine for packing pieces up in your machine vise. Use a ground parallel across the back of the shim. Then I measure the height from there. Well, I won't use it with the shim in. I'll take the shim out, which I can't now do. There we go. Put that across the casing, measure from there to the back of the bearing, get that height, subtract the width of that, then I know how recessed the bearing is on there. And then I will do the same on this half, straight edge across this casing, measure from there to the face of the oil pump, which sits in there, which is what clamps that. So I'll measure from there to the face of the oil pump, get that height as well. And using the 2 heights, I can then work out what the gap is between. And then I know that that gap needs to not be a gap anymore. It actually needs to be a negative. It needs to be an amount sticking out. And from that, I can work out the thickness of the shim. I don't know if this one will be correct or not. I haven't done that yet. There may be one missing from there as well. I don't know. Find out in a bit. But yeah, basically, I was hoping to have this finished this afternoon, but I'm going to need to get a shim for there. And I also forgot to order a screw for this, which is going to come up this afternoon. I had to drill one of the screws out on the oil pump when I stripped this down. They're very, very tight, Loctited in, and they're countersunk headed Torx things, and one of them just would not come out, and I ended up having to drill the head off it. So, and I forgot to order the replacement, so that's on the way. So it's just down to how long it takes me to get these a 0.45mm one of those shims from Toyota, plus if I need one for here. So we'll find out. We'll have a phone call to our good man at Toyota I forgot which branch of Toyota it is now that we use, Lister's Toyota. Very, very helpful people anyway, so I'll be speaking to them shortly to find out whether they have any shims in stock or how quick they can get them. So that's where we're at with that, and on that note, we'll wander next door and into my usual lair of fabrication and dirty, grindy stuff. I don't mind doing gearboxes now and again. I'm just happy not to do them every day. It's nice to do a bit of measuring now and again. But yeah, wandering this way, I think we will swing past the Project 1 Mark1 Escort as the first port of call. We'll go there first and see where Scott's at on that. He is currently undertaking the bit we've been waiting to do for a while, but I've just not had a chance to get onto it, which is the engine mock-up. So Sherwood Engines are building the engines for this and the sister Escort, which is parked over there. And they sent us a short while ago an engine for mock-up purposes, which is now dropped in. Scott's making the engine mounts for that. Interestingly, I'd forgotten about this when we were planning this, so I just bought standard Escort BDA engine mounts from Motorsport Tools. What I'd forgotten is that similarly to the Mark1 Escort twin cam, the factory Escort BDA, Escort RS1600s, actually mounted the engine on an angle that way, so that the throttle bodies, obviously they had throttle bodies then, the carburettors, the twin carburettors cleared the master cylinder. And they could actually get them in, and they actually did. I don't know whether that was done specifically for the RS1600 as well, but I do remember reading that certainly it was done as like the famous weekend build that Borum did to come up with the Lotus Twin Cam Escort. They were scratching their heads as to how to get it all in, and as it was a built over the weekend job, they angled the engine, everything suddenly resolved itself and everything fitted, so they went with that as a solution. Now, I'd forgotten that Ford did the same with the BD, so the engine sits on an angle. We didn't really want it to sit on an angle. We have no need for it to sit on an angle because we don't have a master cylinder down there. So Scott's we're doing our own engine mounts, which has enabled us to just shuffle the engine forward very slightly as well, which helps us in a couple of areas. There's one little bit of the bell housing that was a little bit tight on the bulkhead. We're using a standard, in inverted commas, Escort big tunnel pressing on this, and it does clear the Mazda gearbox. It doesn't clear the shifter turret, so we'll build a turret on the top of the tunnel, not sort of unlike the ZF gearbox Escorts. We'll build a bit of like a ZF shift tower type affair for that, which I think will look quite nice, and that'll clear the shifter section. For the rest of the gearbox, even including the big PPF mount that sits on the side of the Mazda 5-speed gearbox, the NA and NB Mazda 5-speed box, that all clears the big tunnel, which is really nice because it's a gearbox conversion that I've kind of always wanted to do. They make a lot of sense. They're brilliant gearboxes. The shift quality is great. I've ranted about it before, I'm sure, but they just make a lot of sense. They're super strong, easily available, dirt cheap, brand new, really nice synchro, great shift quality, and now we know it fits in a big tunnel, a standard big tunnel on an Escort, other than the shifter area, which we've got to notch out and build a little tower for. Nothing too drastic there. So that's now, I say in, it's loosely in, and as I say, Scott's just drawn up the mounts. In fact, he's literally behind us out of camera, just about to do some TIG welding on the mounts. But he's drawn up the bits on CAD this morning, he's just CNC plasmid them out, and he's just fabricating up. He's drawn new back plates up so we can shift the mount centre lines a bit, and yeah, it's cracking on with that. It'll be a very nice setup. Interestingly, our little gem from Sherwood's, which I was quite impressed by actually, on the underside of the sump that's fitted to this engine, it had protective masking tape on it. The engine was delivered on those, on like the stand frames, which are over on the pallet over there, to keep it all safe, and it was delivered on those, which is not an unusual thing. And I hadn't looked underneath it until Scott had got it in the car, and then I peered underneath it yesterday. Scott's put some more protective masking tape on it, but I noticed whilst peering underneath it, written on the masking tape under the engine is, "This is your sump," which I thought was a classic from Sherwood's. That's a good way of saying, don't ruin it, which I was very impressed by. I like that. So yeah, credit to Sherwood's on that one. Another indicator of the detail, the detail, even on this mock-up engine, the detail is seriously impressive. I have to say that the level of thought that goes into the smallest little details on these is very impressive. We'll go more into that when we have the actual engines rather than the mock-up ones. But yeah, that's the same type of thinking ahead detail with writing "This is your sump" on the masking tape on the underside of the sump, where most people are going to drag it across something and scrape it and ruin it, and then complain about it being ruined. So we can't now because we've been warned. So marching on, we will move on to the Churchill Jag. We'll go round here and say hello to Mr. Stu, who is working on a rear valance. He's been doing a bit, actually, I hadn't noticed, they might have been last week. I hadn't noticed the fuel tank clamp brackets in last week. I don't know if they were in last week, actually, but anyway, he's made some fuel tank clamp brackets, so if they weren't, I didn't mention them last week, so maybe they weren't, but yeah, he's done those two triangular brackets that you can see on the over axle section in the boot are the brackets that the fuel tank clamp straps will bolt down to. And I think they've got I'm guessing the cutouts in them are to allow the fuel hoses to pass through. Yeah, Stu's nodding. So he's thought of everything as usual. So that's all in there and done, and that it completes the sort of well, not quite completes because we need a fuel filler, but it completes the location of the fuel tank in the boot anyway, and the relevance to the metalwork that Stu was working on. So he's now moved on. Oh, I skipped over something there. He's also made a section, a rather nice piece to go in the middle of the spare wheel well to locate the spare wheel in there. That needs to be reasonably strong actually, because obviously you want to take account of accident forces when you build these things. Obviously it's not something we ever want to address, but a spare wheel is a pretty heavy duty projectile projectile if it starts to fly out when you have a big crash. So it wants to be held in fairly well, and to that end Stu's made a lovely little, beautifully done as always with Stu, rolled a nice cone, flanged it, welded a disc in the top, put a threaded insert in it and a reinforcer, and then got all that. I don't know if that's welded in yet. No, it's not welded in yet, but he's made all that section to carry the spare wheel in the boot. And he's now, obviously, to state the obvious, working on the rear valance section, which is not dissimilar to the Utah project. It's not the same, but it's not dissimilar. The lights are going to be different on the back of this car, and the cutout in the centre very slightly different, and just the general approach to a few bits of it a little bit different. But we are smoothing off the rear end in a similar fashion. We're not doing the fully faired wheels on this, and as I say, the lights are going to be different. There will be detailed differences, but the principle is going to be very similar at the back because we've really liked how it looked on Utah. So the principle is being carried on. So Stu's done a little aluminium mock-up number plate, and he's making the plate recess now, which he's then going to, sorry, I'm knocking my microphone, he's then going to cut that into the rear panel such that I think, are we going flush on the top part of the or we flush at the bottom of the plate and then recessed at the top?
I think it's going to be flush at the corners.
Ah, right, yeah. Yeah, it looks about flat top to bottom, doesn't it? Yeah. So basically it'll cut into the radius of the rear panel, so it'll be flat at the side, flush at the sides to the, more or less flush at the sides. Obviously there's a slight rad vertically on the panel as well. It'll be more or less flush at the sides, going to a deeper recess in the middle to allow a flat plinth for the plate to sit in on the back. So that's the current operation going on here. As I say, as Cal's mentioned, we're only on Wednesday this week because of we need to get video editing done a little bit earlier because Jamie's on marching orders this week, so we've got to get it done a little bit earlier. So yeah, next week you'll see a chunk of progress on that because we'll have rolled over a little bit further that time. So moving on from that, we're going to wander into the body shop where quite a lot's going on all different fronts, and I'll probably forget things. We'll go into here. Gary's hiding somewhere. Gary's gone today?
Funeral.
Oh, right, okay. We'll start with the obvious because I'm walking past it, it's right in front of us. Final wet block sanding of the Camaro. We've had a couple of to and fro's in terms of the primer, which we touched on last week. The big change for this week is that it is now raptored inside the car, wherever trim's going to be fitted inside, which is basically all of it on one of these, has all been raptored. Inside the boot's all been raptored, and then all the underside is raptored in all in black textured raptor, textured finish on that, which is really nice. And then the primer work's all done, so now on to the wet block sanding, the final stage before final paint. Assuming we don't have any catastrophic rub-throughs or anything like that, then that'll be the final stage before final paint. So it's yeah, good progress and coming along really well. And we've got several acres to paint then. So that's the first stage in terms of things to cover in here. In the background, I think the Stratos rear clam, is that?
That's ready for paint.
That's ready for paint. Is that raptored?
Yeah.
Yes. So the Stratos rear, I'm having to work this one out as I go because there's that many things going on. But yeah, the Stratos rear clam is in the booth, inside raptored, waiting for paint for the outside paint, which I'm guessing will be tomorrow, all being well, because that's being mixed. And then a few other little bits and bobs going on. And then the other big one, right at the back, is the Jensen, where I think Tom has just about had enough of doors.
Yeah.
So no, he may have gone. He may have left. He's been having a bit of a rough time with the doors. I think he's getting there now. He's certainly approaching. It's just working with a moving target. I explained a lot last week. We're working with moving targets, fiberglass panels that every time you adjust something, it seems to move everything in different directions. Working with trims that are not symmetrical, trims that don't really have any particularly great method of fixing them. Just a whole lot of stack up of errors that make it extremely difficult to do. The word on the Jensen every week, oh, this bit was difficult. Well, it is, unfortunately. He is very, very close now to having the door skins actually fitting. He's got a little bit to weld in at the top of that one. The reinforcer that fit, the diagonal reinforces double skin section that's sort of welded into this corner that enables the door skin to fit to the inner door. So I had to take those back out because we weren't quite happy with the shape here. Just because the bonnet between being fitted and then being fitted again seems to be in a slightly different place. It's bolting the hinges on once and bolting the hinges on again seems to make a difference to the width of it, and we don't really know why because it's all bolted to the same place. But the cumulative error between that and the door skin being a little bit narrow there has meant that area's got to come out, and for that area to come out, this area needs raising as well, and the whole of that area needs bringing up. And to do that, the double skin section that's behind there needed taking back out. So we've had a bit of a 2-step forward, 1 step back on that. I think he is getting pretty close now. He's getting pretty close to having these done, but also getting pretty close to the end of his tether, I think. He's done pretty well, and it would be testing me quite severely by this point. It's not a straightforward job, and it's one of those things where if he doesn't plug away with it, somebody else has got to plug away with it. There's nobody here that can do it any different, any better, any work, whatever. There is no answer other than to keep plugging away at it, keep fiddling with the adjustments, keep putting it back on, and it's taking it on, off, until it's right, which it's getting close to now. But it's the people talk about the glamour of building cars, and it's all very nice looking at all the shiny stuff when it's finished. But let me tell you, bits of the job like this are far removed from that. They are a horrible slog of unpleasantness. But it's getting very, very close now. And a lot of the fiberglass work is now extremely close to where it needs to be in terms of the finished points. So I think I mentioned it last week. I mention it again now. We will imminently be calling on KS Composites to come and visit and have a look with us at various parts of the car to determine where we might, what we've missed in terms of what they need to be able to mould from it, and ideas on how we're going to do flanges where we think we or they, or both probably, think it's going to be difficult to put flanges on due to constraints that we've got in place, and how we might get around that. So we need to have that discussion with them. And that's getting quite close now. Once the doors are finished off, we've got a few bits to sort out in terms of the bonnet, a couple of bits on the rear wheel arches, and various bits to do with trims fitting. And then we're pretty much at the stage of getting KS to come and have a look at it and hold our hands a bit on it and just get it sort of so we're both together and happy that it's ready to go to them for some moulding work. So watch this space on that one. Hopefully we won't be looking at doors next week. And I think on that note, I think that pretty much wraps up where we are. I'll have missed something, but that pretty much wraps up where we are. So until next week, have fun and we'll see you then.